Hello, and thank you for joining us for the CyCognito Bugcrowd, CyCognito and Bugcrowd webinar on strengthening your security posture by combining the power of both companies, external attack surface management with the human ingenuity of crowdsourced security testing. As a reminder, and it's on the screen, but this webinar is being recorded and will be available for playback. My name is Randy Strew. I lead the partner team here at CyCognito. It's my pleasure to be partnered with our friends over at Bugcrowd and to be your moderator for today. This should be a fun conversation. I'm joined today by Casey Ellis, the founder and chief strategy officer of Bugcrowd, and Rob Gurzeev, and our fearless leader, founder and CEO of CyCognito. Casey, Rob, thank you both for joining us today for what I'm sure is going to be an insightful and hopefully entertaining conversation, since I know both of you. It should be fun. For the attendees here, please, we've got a Q&A chat window where you can post your questions, and we can answer some of those as we go. And we may save some of those time permitting for the end for live Q&A at the end of the session. All right, well, gentlemen, let's get started. But before we dive in too deeply into the Q&A and those things, I think it'd just be great if the audience got to know you both, that kind of your backgrounds, how you got the companies founded, sort of those sorts of things. And Rob, if you don't mind, I'll put you on the spot and have you lead us off.
Happy to, and excited to do it together, Casey. So Rob Gurzeev, I'm co-founder of CyCognito. I got into this realm of reconnaissance and pen testing around the age of 14, and I was lucky enough to get into the 8200 Elite Intelligence Unit, the Israeli NSA, at the age of 18 exactly, to this, call it, area. And later I had the privilege to lead it for a number of years. So from a very early age, I would say, I saw the huge potential and coolness also of this domain, understanding organizations, attack surfaces, what attackers can actually do, how do you get in. And we started CyCognito around 7 years ago now to help enterprise security teams understand their external attack surfaces and continuously monitor attackers' paths of least resistance into their networks and data. So I'm sure we'll have a super interesting conversation here. And Casey, to you.
Thanks, Rob. And yeah, thank you, CyCognito, for having us on, and very excited about the partnership as well. We're going to jam into that more as we go along. But yeah, a little bit about me. I'm Casey Ellis. I'm the founder and chief strategy officer for Bugcrowd. I'm also the co-founder of the Disclose.io project. Basically, Bugcrowd pioneered this space in terms of crowdsourced security testing as a service, like taking all of the latent potential that exists in the white hat security researcher community and engineering it into the gaps that we have as defenders. Ultimately, our job, when you think about it, is to outsmart a human creative adversary that has lots of different skill sets, lots of different motivations, and really an incentive for success. When I started the company, having grown up as a hacker and moved off into offensive security and then solutions, part of what I noticed about the industry is that when you think about the math of the problem that we're trying to solve here, like one person being paid by the hour in a traditional pen testing capacity, no matter how good they are, they're going to fail because the math is wrong. So, given that that's true and that's a problem that we face as an industry, and given the fact that there is this enormous pool of hackers who operate in good faith, of which I was a part, that's kind of my upbringing in computer science and security, kind of waiting at the table, wanting to help, having that be unplugged from being a part of the solution to the problem seemed kind of stupid to me at the time. So the light bulb went on, and we built out Bugcrowd as a company and as a platform. Ultimately, what the platform does at this point in time is it really connects. It's almost like a dating website for people that break computers. And as I said before, our goal is to engineer the creativity that we've got available in the community into all the different kinds of problems that people need to solve from a security standpoint. It's most commonly known and understood as a bug bounty or a pen testing or a VDP platform. Those are three of the things that we're able to do in market, but in reality, the flexibility of what we have available from a crowd and a platform standpoint is pretty much unlimited at this point in time. So the idea of being able to partner with folks who've been so thoughtful about the problem of attack surface management in the CyCognito way, CyCognito kind of philosophy, that's exciting to me, because I think the relationship between human creativity and automation is one that we're going to be dealing with pretty much in perpetuity as defenders. So yeah, very cool to be here, and looking forward to the jam.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad I don't have to follow either one of you on the introduction now. But so you guys have great backgrounds. I always like to start these discussions with a little bit of a look back, right? Like, how do we get here? For me, always interesting, especially given your backgrounds as you just described them, because you have a very unique point of view from this perspective, right? Living in the attacker's world, whereas most of us, myself included, many years ago, we're on the defensive side, managing IT infrastructures and those sorts of things. A very different world when you live on the inside versus when you're living on the outside as an adversary. So let's start there. And I want to start a little bit away from not necessarily technology, but more like what's changed from a business environment perspective that's forcing people to, both vendors and customers, vendors like ourselves, both of us, and customers, to rethink how we secure ourselves against today's modern attacks and adversaries and the things that they're doing. Again, let's start really more on the business side of things and what's the challenges that's created versus the tech, and we'll kind of get to the technology and the automation and human ingenuity here in a second. Casey, lead us off.
Yeah, no, for sure. This is a fantastic question. I like the fact that we're going to start at the business level and then kind of geek out as we go. And for context there, you're right in terms of calling out the fact that I kind of got into security on the red side of things. I actually did move across into defensive architecture and solutioneering for a period of time before I broke bad and did the entrepreneur thing. So yeah, I think my perspective in a weird way is kind of informed by both sides of the coin on this one, but probably mostly on the breaker side of things, because that's just how I'm wired. So I think, one of the biggest things that's shifted in the last 10 years is the fact that, the average non-technical internet user actually cares about this stuff. They understand that cybersecurity is a thing that affects them. They don't necessarily understand what that means, or the technical nuance or how to even protect themselves, but they recognize the fact that it's a thing. That wasn't true 10 years ago, and I think that's a really important thing to call out in terms of the motion of the market forces that exist around cybersecurity at this point in time. I think a lot of folks that have joined more recently have just kind of assumed that we've always had the level of attention and support in our mission that we have today in 2024. In 2014, it looked radically different. And I expect that trend to continue over time. At this point, the consumer views cyberspace as an extension of their physical environment. And when you think about humans and how they consider physical safety, it's kind of transiting onto the internet now. And I think that's a really important thing to consider for everyone, really, at this point in time. Probably the second piece is that CISOs are, they're almost a victim of our own success at this point in time, because cybersecurity is being integrated into just overall risk management for a business. It has been treated historically as this kind of weird, geeky thing that sits in the corner. But you got stuff like, SEC regulations being passed that actually hold boards accountable for their understanding of cybersecurity and different things like that. That puts a lot of pressure on a CISO to basically be a bridge, between what's happening from a technology and a threat standpoint into the business and into risk management from an overall, governance standpoint. And that's, again, it's a relatively new phenomena. For defenders, our job has never been more evident in its importance, but we're still under, the kind of pressure that we've always been under to demonstrate return on investment. The funny thing about defensive security is that if it works, nothing happens. And actually explaining the return on investment of that to people that don't necessarily think in the way that we do can be kind of tricky, and that continues to be true. So I think that's an important call out. Last one is that, for hackers that operate in good faith, I think the world is a safer and more inviting place for us than it was 10 years ago. The first probably 3 or 4 years of Bugcrowd was spent kind of shouting from the rooftops that hackers aren't always evil. Like, there is the equivalent to the digital locksmith and not just the burglar, which is kind of where we started off, back in 2013. And, seeing things like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act change, and even just the adoption of our model in general, I think we're at a point in time where there's still explaining required, but the idea that hackers can be helpful and aren't just harmful, I think that's pretty well understood at this point.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, definitely. We're not the bad guys, right? We are the good guys, and it's a bit like selling insurance, I suppose.
Sometimes hackers are the bad guys, and that's part of the difficulty. I think, you know, hacking is a morally agnostic skill set, and it can be applied in ways that are harmful. But the thing that people have realized that there's a very valuable and beneficial side to it as well.
Yeah, yeah. It's super helpful. Rob, please give us your thoughts.
Awesome points, especially on the how could the consumer and the SEC changes things. But if we go even back, the way I think about it is, you know, what we're talking about as a space is related to vulnerability management, penetration testing, AppSec. And if you go back like 20 years, even Apple, Google, and those guys had maybe one website exposed to the internet, so one web application, and they had between 0 and 1 networks connected to the internet at all. So I think that when these practices and technologies were developed, folks knew what to focus on, and it was mostly a routine and a pretty straightforward process in the sense of scope. And I think that one huge difference conceptually is now when you have thousands of networks connected to the internet, and you have thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of web applications connected to the internet, and every DevOps instance, every router, every internal tool might have something exposed to the internet, and so to attackers and to hackers of all sorts. The scoping question and coverage questions are completely different, and maybe that's becoming a huge portion of the overall challenge and work versus 1% 20 years ago. And I think that has been a very exponential process, and so applications are becoming more complex, and so you need better and more skilled folks to reverse engineer these applications and to thoroughly test them. But you also want to solve the coverage and scope problem, because otherwise you might be focusing on the front door and the back door will be completely open.
Yeah, that's definitely a good call out. You know, in 2024, like the internet itself is potentially your network, and it's almost a problem of proving that thing over there isn't yours. Whereas 10 years ago, it's like, okay, here's my environment, here's my perimeter. Like, let's go find everything within that particular space. We've kind of tipped the problem upside down with the adoption of cloud and all those different things, which are incredible facilitators, but obviously, you know, carry security risks with them and create a whole new set of problems.
Right. And that's related, Casey, to another great point you made about how do I measure it? How do I measure success? How do I communicate that to management or other folks? And I think that measurement and ROI is also like its importance, and folks being interested in that, and board members starting to get to understand what kind of questions to ask about it. Like, hey, do we have some zero trust around in this company? It's a cool thing I heard about. Are we implementing it? Versus where are we doing it, where we are not doing it, and what risk are we taking by not doing whatever?
Yeah, absolutely. This is I think it's what I'm about to say is preempting a question that we've got a little further on, but this shift from capability-based defense, where it's like you need to tick a box or have zero trust because it's the new hotness and the board's telling you to do it, like all those different things, moving forward from that to capability and to risk and exposure based capability, and actually understanding what that means, because it's going to vary business to business, and ultimately that's the thing that ties back to business risk.
Exactly. And from a business risk perspective, maybe to finish our first topic here, for example, this company got compromised because of some stolen credentials, and they had a top-tier identity management solution in place. Post-breach, they learned that they only had it deployed at about 30 out of the 600 authentication mechanisms and applications they had. So from a value quantification perspective, how do you quantify protecting extremely well half of these applications.
Definitely. Randy, we're going to riff on forever if you don't interject. So I think
no. I'm right in. No, that was super helpful. It's a good conversation. I didn't want to interrupt. So
Sure.
yeah, nice back and forth. Well, I launched the poll there. Hopefully, the audience has had a chance to answer. I see about 36% participation. So if you haven't taken the chance yet, please do. I'll give you just a moment longer for us to capture that poll real quick. All right, well, let's just move on. We'll capture that there. Let's share the results here. So it looks like the majority of the audience has about 1 to 50 web apps that they're exposed web apps that they're testing currently, and then some with over 1,000, which is impressive. So the range is enormous, as are possibly the company sizes, right? I mean, I think that obviously takes into account as well as the type of business that they operate. But I think this, if you look at the larger numbers, especially, it speaks to the problem you guys were just talking about, which is the enormity of how big this problem has gotten from where it used to be, right? And I've heard somebody mention this before. We used to be hunting for the needle in the haystack, and now we're hunting for the sharpest needle in the stack of needles, right? It's just immense, the pile of data that we have to get through, and being able to find the true thing that is the critical risk in the organization is really difficult. I think this is where we can pivot the conversation to how automation and humans can collaborate together to hopefully stay ahead, right? We got to try to stay out in front of the adversaries. So we'll kick off with the next question. I think this has me really kind of pivot away then from the business question and more to the more to the technology and how that's evolved, because obviously we're in tech, and really everybody's in tech these days. There's really not many companies that don't have some sort of technical presence. And so, Rob, I'll start with you, I think, and then I'll ask Casey a similar but slightly different question. We hear this all the time, and you mentioned it. There's been external scanners and open source tools and all kinds of things that, for years, up to 20 years. And there's a lot of tools out there today that are already, quote, scanning the entire internet daily and those sorts of things. And many of our customers use those and depend on those, right? I think, Casey, the same be true of Bugcrowd's customers. They're well known, and they've been doing the best job they could for years. But I guess my question to you is, are those approaches still sufficient? And if they're not, why not? And how has, Rob, in our particular case, attack surface and exposure management evolved to influence the way companies should be thinking about, managing their external risk today? I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I think about it, Nmap, Nessus, classic pen testing, and other such tools exist since, I think, 96, 97 or so. And I think most people would say they haven't changed much. Maybe some would say at all over these almost 30 years now, actually. Maybe I need to update the last 20 years pitch. I think there are three main problems.
You're giving me flashbacks here, Rob. We'll have to Google that one afterwards. You're in the ballpark.
Yeah, my co-founder, Dima, was surprised that Nmap that he knows and is using for 20 plus years are still one of the prime ways for folks in many enterprises to do so much. So I think there are three main challenges that can be solved with automation today and modern technology. The first, so we are talking about visibility, risk detection, and prioritization. On the visibility side, one of the biggest challenges is, one, uncovering these complete unknowns, or unknown unknowns and blind spots, where, for example, port scanning cannot lead you to finding these subsidiary you don't know about, or these cloud asset that is used in this marketing campaign or was built by a third party for your project. So there are many edge cases that are extremely hard to find, that you can find manually, but that can take between weeks to months. Speak from experience, especially at very large organizations. So if you're looking for something specific, you should do that. But at scale, how do you solve that continuously? So today, machine learning algorithms and graph data models and NLP, that combination actually allows you to go from company name or even nothing to mapping the organization structure, finding these blind spots. And also another missing puzzle piece for the traditional solutions is providing evidence and probability on these findings. Otherwise, it's just creating so much work for the security team that even if it, some of the needles are there, it's not as helpful because you can deal with 10 needles a day and 100 more are added to the pile, right? So that's one critical area. The second area on the testing side, today it is possible to automate many parts, not all parts, but many parts of risk detection. On the AppSec side, some elements of DAST and OWASP top 10 kind of issues detection can be automated, not reverse engineering, and we'll see how much time that takes to automate, maybe never or not in our lifetime. And creativity is so critical there, and skill and experience. But various pieces can be detected. So you definitely want to do that across 100% of your applications. We ran this poll, and I think most folks said they were testing 10 to 50 or something like that web interfaces in the dozens or 100. I think on average, folks have between 500 and 10,000 web interfaces exposed to the internet. So that's one way to increase coverage massively, not on reverse engineering and very deep assessments, but at some very relevant level of testing for sure. And then on prioritization, my last point, I think that CVSS also exists for 15 years, and Metasploit and that kind of databases have existed for, I would guess, I don't remember, around 15 years, definitely more than 10. But elements like asset business importance and leveraging machine learning to leverage heuristics on what is this asset. Is that a payment mechanism? Is that a ticketing system? Is there PII on the asset? So if you're looking at 10,000 web interfaces and tens of thousands of machines or millions of machines, how are you going to do that at scale so that the humans, your skilled team, and your vendors and partners can focus on what matters? So that's another huge advancement, I think, that makes a huge, huge difference on mean time to remediation. And Casey, feel free to share your thoughts.
No, look, I fully agree with all of that. I think my perspective on automation just in general, like it's bad guys operate in the gaps. So whatever we figure out how to automate and solve to as close to 100% as we can as defenders, like their literal job as a criminal, like the business model of criminals, regardless of what their incentive is to innovate past those gaps and figure out what we've left behind. So to me, this idea of automating to solve a security issue to 100%, it's kind of not necessarily the game that we're playing here. It's like, how do you use automation and leverage it to get as much efficiency as you possibly can with the things that are able to be automated? And that includes, like, I look at machine learning and AI as like step function accelerators of that, not necessarily like this radical new thing. It's you look at Nmap, one of the reasons that's still being used as a tool is that people have figured out different ways to use it. One other thing that I would say with that, going back to that point that you raised there, is that I think tooling in and of itself, Nmap, when it first got dropped, I know the author quite well, and I was tempted in the background to reach out and say, when did you start that thing? I think back in the day, the kind of problems that we're trying to solve from a attack surface awareness and understanding and an exploitation standpoint were a lot simpler and a lot smaller in scope than they are, now in 2024. So running a tool like that was almost a silver bullet. Like the sky opened up, you learn a whole bunch of new things, you can go off and fix it, because that was the nature of the internet at the time. Like that's clearly not true anymore. Those tools still in the hands of the right users can be actually leveraged to do some pretty amazing things. But that evolution of tooling and then the role, again, this sort of interface between human creativity and the creation and the awareness of the need of that type of automation, I think that's a game that we're going to be playing long into the future. And even looking back, I think it's something that we've seen appear out of the bug bounty space. Like when you think about what we're doing in terms of crowdsourcing creativity, one of the incentive models that we have is basically, we invite a group of people in based on their ability to understand the problems that are needing to be solved, or the things that need to be exploited, and incentivize them based on success. So the first to find a unique issue is the one who gets paid, and the more severe that issue is, the greater the rewards. So they're incentivized to create impact in the same way a bad guy would be. And what was really interesting in those programs, especially when there was an open scope, is that the clever ones went trying to look where everyone maybe wasn't looking. So that they bypassed the front door and looked to the fringes of the organization and started to look beyond that. And lo and behold, there was a whole bunch of stuff laying around on the public internet that the organization just had no knowledge of. So their defensive graph was very different to the size of the attacker graph that was available. And the bounty hunters actually proved that. Like that led to automation that was kind of the precursor to the ASM and the EASM market that we're talking about today. This is back in 2013, 2014. To me, that's an example of like the role humans play in actually, surfacing the opportunities to automate. And then as we do those things well, that cycle, I think, continues.
Yeah, it's a super interesting perspective for sure. Rob,
Yeah, that's a super cool. Yeah, that's a very cool and very important area, I think, that you guys are innovating in, which is how do you communicate scope, recommendations, targets, and success at scale with customers, and ideally continuously.
Yeah. And at the same time, how do we make use of automation? This is, again, an example of why I get super excited about this partnership, because, the way and the thoughtfulness that's been applied to solving the EASM problem that CyCognito have in the hands of people that are thinking about how to use that and then kind of go forward and create impact based on that knowledge. That's a really powerful combination. And ultimately, it doesn't make sense for them to do that stuff themselves anymore. Like that was a thing that bug bounty hunters figured out was a useful way to find risk back in 2013. Like that's the fact that this is a problem in the first place is kind of old news. We don't need people to repeat, that message. It's a perfect candidate for automation, and that's sort of where I think the automation piece comes in to actually help us do what we do as well.
And I think to Randy's earlier point about, and in case you talked about it too, how do you measure success and the changes in the market over the last 10, 20 years? I think that traditionally folks started from, I have X amount of dollars, I have $100,000 to invest in pen testing or AppSec or what have you. And the question was, where do I throw it? And hopefully I'll see some value out of that. And hopefully psychologically, I will feel good about my investment. And I'll be able to explain, and I'll be able to explain to others why it made sense. And I think that to your point, and I think both of our companies are doing a lot in these areas, how do you quantify the value created and how do you make sense of that? Yeah,
100%.
Super interesting points. I have I guess it's an adjacent or analogous question. It's one of those that, again, is sort of an ex-IT guy way back in the day. But when I talk to partners and customers, it's one of the things we still hear about. There's this notion of compliance, right? And being compliant and having to satisfy regulatory concerns. And then there's real risk reduction and the things that people do to protect themselves. Those aren't completely mutually exclusive. There's an intersection there. I think the question that I have for both of you, and maybe I'll ask Casey to start, is like, where does one leave off? Where does the other begin? And at some point, like, when do we think about compliance through the lens of risk in versus I'm going to go check this box, I'm going to pass my compliance audit, and off I go, when we both, or all of us, know that I can easily pass a compliance audit and yet have tons of risk of being exposed to the environment. So how do we give, I guess, compliance some teeth in that regard where it becomes more meaningful again, like it was when it first was introduced? I'll just ask it that way and let you guys.
Yeah, 100%. I think the when it was first introduced, part of that question is the really important part, because compliance in a risk management, and especially in a cyber risk management context, is meant to be a trailing indicator. And I think more often than not, we've treated it as a leading one. So the whole idea of like, yeah, PCI DSS says I need to do these things. Once I've done these things, we're good to go. That was never really the intent of compliance frameworks in the first place. Like the idea is to say, okay, here's your like minimum height to ride the roller coaster. And if you're not doing these things, then you're really not doing a good job. It's more of a baseline, but I think we treat it as like the goal oftentimes from an implementation standpoint. I honestly think the reason for that is that security is hard. Like it's hard enough to run a business and build all these things and have them work, right? There's justifiably a lot of effort for any given company put into making things happen for customers and users, and that's not a trivial thing to do. So to then, on top of that, try to get it not to do all the stuff that it's not meant to do that could create a security issue, like that's a fundamentally difficult problem to solve. So to acknowledge the fact that compliance is an attempt to bridge that gap. I cut my teeth on the solution side around the same time the PCI DSS first landed in Australia. So I'm based in San Francisco now, but as you can hear, I'm not originally from around these parts. And watching the acceleration of that, it was actually very useful at that point in time in the evolution of the cybersecurity mindset in APAC to get a lot of organizations kind of from a standing start to doing something, right? But then, nowadays you hear people that are thinking about security from a risk management standpoint that'll kind of treat PCI DSS or compliance just in general as sort of a swear word. I think that's because we've confused, being able to kind of explain the things that we need to the business in a language that auditors and the business will understand, and also pass this kind of must be this minimum height to ride thing. We've actually confused that with effective risk management. To me, the two aren't mutually exclusive. It's just that you can do one without doing the other, and I think that's where we get kind of wrapped around the axle.
Yeah, makes sense. And Rob, I'll ask you I guess the similar question, like, where does compliance end, and where does risk mitigation, like truly pivoting away from the check the box to, controlling risk? How are those things going to converge and merge over time? And I might ask you guys, let me bleed into another topic as you answer, because how do like C-levels folks that you guys talk to all the time think about that and reporting, how we stand against compliance regulations and risk exposure? And I'll let Rob answer, and then Casey maybe circle back around to the executive, again, measurement, because you've both spoken about it. But for the people on that are attending or that listen to this post fact, like, what are the top 5 things that they ought to be measuring? Based on all the conversations you've had with hundreds of thousands of clients that you hear constantly across the board. Rob, I'll let you kick things off.
That's a great question and a super interesting topic, and completely agree, Casey, on where it started and where we are now. There's a meme about that. I think, yeah.
Yep.
I think, Randy, that from conversations I've had with CISOs and risk leaders over the years, 10 years ago, I would say carefully, most management teams didn't know exactly what to measure. And maybe that's how compliance became a prominent tool, proxy to, are we secure? So people were asking, are we secure? And then you would get some kind of an answer from the CISO. And then you would have compliance. But maybe that was it in most organizations, even Fortune 500 CISOs. Organizations and CISOs. In the last few years, I'm seeing exponential increase. There's still a lot of way to go, absolutely, but exponential increase in CEOs and board members' interest in what's actually going on. And I think that the standard way to have that discussion today, to your question, Randy, is like, what's our NIST framework posture, and how does it compare with last year, and how does it compare to these 5 or 10 other companies that are similar to us? And then many companies talk about how many critical vulnerabilities they have, and often they talk about the mean time to remediation on all of these vulnerabilities. And then each CISO, it seems, has slightly different other metrics. Some focus on maybe cloud, some focus on endpoint, some focus on maybe zero trust. But that's, I wouldn't say all over the place, but there is a big variety of what
like different
folks...
lenses, right? Different lenses they can look at it through, and none of them are complete, none of them are perfect, but they're getting kind of a multi-dimensional view of it, right? And trying to make some sense of it, right? Is maybe what I hear you saying there, Rob.
Right. Yeah. And maybe I'll finish by saying that I'm now seeing in the last couple of years exponentially more CISOs who also want to measure like an unbiased perspective on risk, and to discuss risk and to quantify risk. I haven't heard that personally 5 or 8 years ago. I'm hearing that a lot in the last couple of years. So they want to quantify that. They want an unbiased perspective.
Like massive +1 on trying to answer the question, like, are we doing this well in a way that has actual data to support the answer and isn't just based on the feels. I think to me that's a byproduct of kind of one of the things that I said at the start, where consumers are concerned about this stuff, and I think the the board and kind of governance around organizations is pretty afraid of getting breached because of the the impact of the organization if that happens, just from a revenue standpoint. But then you've got things like the SEC pieces that we talked about before. You've got things like the different privacy acts that exist around the world that actually require public notification if there is a breach. Like, there's all of these different things where on top of saying that they've done security well and being able to pass compliance audits and all those different things, the second question is, cool, I've done all of that. Now I actually really don't want to get hacked. What does that mean to my organization specifically? And I do think that it's going to vary from organization to organization, but there are themes that tend to pop up reliably. So how am I actually going to avoid getting hacked? Like, how do I prioritize the activities that are going to minimize the likelihood of that? There's a whole bunch of new factors that come into finding the answer to that question. It's like, what does my vulnerability posture look like? What is the type of threat actor that I'm expecting to deal with? What's the level of resourcing and tenacity that I can expect from that threat actor? So on and so forth. And it's going to be different for every organization. So I think to me, one of the biggest things is the presence or absence of a proper threat model. And to be able to actually talk through that, because at that point you can actually contextualize all these things that you've maybe initiated for compliance reasons and figure out how important they are, and if you need to double down on investment, or if you can just kind of leave it there as a capability within your organization. That's a big one. I do think mean time to remediation, it's interesting what we get to watch, because it really is this kind of, on one side, we've got this crowd of people that are thinking like bad guys, but doing good guy things. And on the other side, we've got this incredibly diverse range of technologies and organizations. Like, we work with companies from, the Department of Defense and government, through technology into critical infrastructure, like automotive. It's a very broad swath of the technology that's represented on the internet at this point in time. Recently AI has jumped into the mix in a big way as well. And the thing that's most consistent that we see is that CISOs that are being thoughtful about the way that we contribute data is to think about it in terms of, okay, this is kind of a proxy indicator of the cost to attack my organization. So if I start a program in, say, a bug bounty context with a a $5,000 top reward, and it takes usually not very long once it first gets switched on to see your first critical issues come through, that's fine, because that's expected. And you're going off now and fixing those things, that's ultimately a good thing. But what you want to see is that time kind of increase. Like, it should get harder over time, right? And at some point in time, you start to increase your rewards, because what you've done is you've increased the cost to attack the business. which ultimately I sort of feel like that's a pretty good summary of why we're all here in the first place. Like, we can't make things perfectly secure. Our job is to make it economically irrational for an attacker to do their thing and try to actually break in and get it done. So like whatever data can be kind of used to infer that, I think is very valuable. And that's an example of how we see what we do get used. Last one I would say, and you mentioned mean time to remediation. I do see a lot of organizations kind of fall into the trap of like this many open ports on the internet equals secure or insecure. And these kind of, to me, that's a leading indicator of the fact that there might be a problem, but it's not like a causal link, if that makes sense. There's people that do that and they've actually got really good security behind that. So it's kind of a perverse indicator. Instead, kind of switching gears to thinking about the fact that, yeah, vulnerabilities are going to happen. I'm not going to prevent 100% of them. So when I find them, if it's critical, like what's my time to assess that criticality and actually put it into remediation? And then how long does it take to remediate? So you mean time to remediation, you mean time of exposure, and just, how well your remediation pipeline is functioning in general as an organization, because ultimately that should start wherever it starts, but trend, down over time. And if that trend is there, then you're probably doing it right.
Absolutely.
For the ones that are meaningful, right? Like the critical business that have the business impact that matters.
I specifically called out P1s and critical issues there, because the other side of this is that there's a lot of non-critical security issues, and ultimately you've got to create a cut line on what you're going to address with the resource that you've got. That's a fact of being rational around defense, and that's just a reality of it. In an ideal world, we could fix every single issue that exists and make everything perfectly secure, but it's not an ideal world. So we've got to figure out where that cut line is and be able to do that ongoing as organizations that are defending our users and our shareholders.
Absolutely. And I think this notion is super true. And how do you economically shift things and align economics with better security with your program and how you're spending your dollars? And your earlier point, Casey, about compliance and how that might relate to this aspect. An area I find really interesting in that regard is subsidiary risk and compliance in subsidiaries. In many cases, for technical reasons, the corporate/global security team might be doing an amazing job in corporate, but then they have 100 subsidiaries, sometimes thousands of them, but call it 100 subsidiaries, and 50% of them are not even doing the very basic things. And today they de facto rely on some basic questionnaires like, are you doing XYZ? And that subsidiary might use a scanner to scan these 100 machines and say, yes, we're good. But then when you're using an unbiased approach to look at that subsidiary, you in fact find some egregious gaps that you really care about and you simply never known about. So that's another interesting thing we've been seeing for sure.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, when you add the kind of probability factor of exposure to the criticality of the vulnerability, like that becomes a really useful tool. So you've got a trusted third-party broker coming in, giving you data instead of it being subjective. And then what you're also doing is kind of looking at things from the outside, which is the most likely place for an attacker to start. So you've got kind of an index on like how likely is this thing to be exploited, on top of like how critical will that be if it happens.
Yep.
Yeah, super interesting. I did launch a poll and we got 39% participation. Maybe just one more second for those of you in the audience that haven't responded, please do real quickly. The answers are in, yeah. We'd like to just get a feel for these questions, please. I'll just give you just a second, and then we're gonna talk about the future, where things are headed.
I love this question because I do think that there is this could be a whole other webinar in and of itself, but like the definition of what a pen test actually is, and can it be crowdsourced or not? It depends on how you're applying that term pen testing within your organization. I think there's huge spread on that at this point in time. So it's always interesting to see the answer to stuff like this.
Yeah, and for those of you not using crowdsourced pen testing, shame on you. You need to be talking to our friends at Bugcrowd. You should be for sure.
We can definitely help with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's good to see that there are some in the audience that have gotten it down to monthly. I mean, that's really fantastic. Because I know, we talk to a lot of clients where annual's the top answer here, and that's what we see. And it definitely just needs to be more frequent than that. I know, Casey, you and Rob talk about this notion of continuous pen testing, and I'm gonna kind of group a couple of things here together in the interest of time, but this notion of this continuous pen test happening on the outside, where it's not just point in time and real isolated and those sorts of things. And my question is gonna evolve into, like, where does this go? Obviously we could stitch these things together today and we can call it continuous pen testing, but how does, you mentioned AI just briefly, Casey, earlier. Look, that's a hot topic today, and I don't think we can have a conversation like this with two industry leaders like yourselves without talking about that. Like, where does that go? How does that impact each of us as companies, and the intersection of what we're going to do together, and associated with this continuous pen testing, continuous risk reduction? I love the way you answered the previous question, Casey, which was, how expensive does it get for people to get to me? I love that way of thinking. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, no, for sure. I appreciate that. Yeah, so I guess the two aspects of that question. I mean, I think when it comes to continuous testing, the reason we don't do it is that paying people by the hour to test on a 24/7 by 365 basis, like, people need to sleep for starters, so that just doesn't work from the outset. But the economics of actually making that work on the defender side don't really make sense. So this idea of, like, in an ideal world, if that was possible, we'd do it. We'd have human creativity applied on a continuous basis to understanding, like, what kind of risks do we have, what kind of things might be new, like what techniques have been newly discovered out there on the internet that we might be vulnerable to. We saw, obviously, like, Log4j is kind of the bingo card example of where that popped up as a problem that we needed to solve very suddenly. And that was a very busy couple of weeks for us, because we deployed the crowd to answer that question. And the customers that were using the crowd on a continuous basis had that question come in organically without them having to trigger that action. So, I do think this idea of distributed kind of collaborative contribution, it does solve that access issue. The idea of being able to share that problem out amongst a group of the right people that have the right skills and the right levels of trust and all those different things that match them most appropriately with your company and the problems that you're trying to solve. Like, that's going back to my dating website depiction of the platform earlier in the webinar. That's really what that does. It makes sure that we're able to deliver the right hackers with the right skill set at the right time. That can either be point in time, or, as we're talking about now, it can be continuous as well. So making sure that you've got that done, I think that is a way to do this, and we see organizations do it all the time. I do think, particularly when it comes to publicly addressable infrastructure, a lot of organizations that run a public bug bounty program actually treat that kind of in this way. It's like, here's our continuous human testing that we're basically soliciting and incentivizing from the open internet. Not every company is in a position where they can or should do that, and I think the private versions kind of fit into that gap and become available to solve problems like this one. I will say as well that the application of this model into internal environments is something that we're doing a lot of as well, especially as kind of the perimeter starts to get blurred. Obviously, having enough trust and enough understanding of the trustworthiness of everyone in the Bugcrowd community to be able to get the right people in, but then also providing them access into internal networks. I think people are often surprised with the level of trust we're actually given to do that at this point in time. So, I do think this idea of being able to deliver continuous human creativity into problems like this one, it is solvable through crowdsourcing and multi-sourcing. That's a lot of why we're here. I think switching gears to AI real quick. I mean, look, it's an interesting one. Like, AI has played a major role in getting Bugcrowd to where we are today. CrowdMatch, which I kind of keep on referring back to, like, that's a machine learning and NLP process underneath that's ultimately powering it. And those are AI tools that we've actually leveraged to make that whole thing work, right? We've used AI in the triage queue for 6 or 7 years at this point in time. So it's funny to hear AI talked about as this brand new thing that's just kind of dumped on the internet. I think what's happened with ChatGPT and others that have kind of popped up over the past period of time is that they've kind of radically democratized access to this kind of tooling and kind of availability of that type of power to the user, and that's captured the imagination of just about everyone, including us. You know, OpenAI is a customer of ours. We work with Google, Anthropic, a bunch of the others that are working on the foundational LLM piece, and it's a fascinating space and it's transformative. So I'm not diminishing it, but that is to say that like this kind of automation's steered, you know, how we've gotten to this point already. So I think, you know, going forward, it's going to be a lot more of kind of the same. Like, how do we take these tools and use it to make the process more efficient? How to increase, you know, the return on investment and time to value for the crowd, for the hackers, and for our customers, as best we possibly can. You know, helping hackers be more effective in a shorter time frame, helping organizations communicate, understand, and remediate security risks. I think there's a lot of opportunity in using LLMs to actually help security people explain things to engineers and people that are ultimately tasked with solving problems but aren't necessarily, you know, wearing a security badge, because that communication gap can often be difficult inside organizations. There's a lot of opportunity there. I don't see it coming in and replacing a whole bunch of stuff, but I do see it making a whole bunch of things more efficiently, and that kind of iteration cycle is going to accelerate.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, especially with the skills gap, right? Like we see in the market today, we hear a lot about that, which is one of the reasons the crowdsourced model is so interesting, right? Like, hey, I can't afford to hire 40 of the greatest pen testers in the world, but, you know, you guys already have them on the bench, let's say, and I can get access to them part-time, you know, in a fractional manner, and I can get literally the best in the world to come.
Yeah, and we understand the success of what they've, you know, the success they've had in environments like yours in the past. You know, the cost to actually activate them, what that output's going to look like. So that's a lot of what we do. Appreciate you calling that out.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. And Rob, please just jump in.
Yeah, I could not agree more with Casey. And the last point I think is super important. How do you utilize special skills, scarce skills, and people to do the most important and frankly sometimes the most difficult work, in my opinion, some of it in the whole cybersecurity space. From my perspective on continuous pen testing, which exponentially more customers, security teams are interested in, I break it down into what's actually happening continuously. What is that continuous in continuous pen testing? And I think there are 2 or 3 elements there that I'll start from the end. One of them is this deep assessment and exploitation and sometimes lateral movement from this way to enter the networks, data, and so on. But that you can't necessarily physically do continuously, definitely not on average if you have 1,000 applications. So the first 2 parts there, from my perspective, are: 1, how do I continuously discover net new things that are exposed, like these applications and assets? How do I continuously make sure that my scope is everything, or that I'm at least aware and monitoring at some level everything? And then the level between 1 and 3, we started from 3, is active security testing, at least as best as you can, of ideally all of those assets. So if you're able to do, from my perspective, and for example, we use Bayesian ML models, which, as Casey mentioned, are actual AI, even though that was available 10, 15 years ago at an enterprise grade, or becoming more common 10, 15 years ago. But those kind of models, NLP, graph data models, and other technologies, you can actually map everything, test everything continuously, at least at a certain level. And by continuous, I mean daily or weekly, definitely at least bi-weekly. And then I think you want these scarce resources, wherever they are, to focus on the most exploitable, the top needles in the haystack or needle pile.
The sharpest needles in the needle pile, maybe.
Exactly. I think that's the model that can work and works for some today. And I think we'll see exponentially more security teams finding ways to get there.
Yeah, I will definitely say that you know, the moment that the ChatGPT dropped and this whole kind of generative AI conversation kicked off, the first thing the hackers did was pick up that tooling and try to hack it in and of itself. So actually attacking these types of systems and learning how to do that to be able to make them more secure. But then, at the same time, they were looking at how they could use it to make themselves more efficient. And that's continued ever since. So I think that's a pretty good leading indicator of what we can expect to see next.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you both. At least a majority, it looks like there's a grouping a little bit in the middle, but there's a large group of people that I think, and look, I think it's healthy to be a little skeptical, right? Well, can AI really play a part? And we all have to do that, because we've seen what can come out of, the chat. Now, again, I love Chat GPT, but what can come out of it if it's not, if it's just not properly informed, right?
Yeah.
So fair enough.
I will say with that, just real quick, Randy, one of the best ways I've heard this characterized is that, at this point in time, AI in 2024 is a lot like having a website around 1997. So the idea of, and that was an old school Valley guy that I borrowed that from. And I think it's 100% true. Like ultimately what this does is it kind of changes the way that we do everything. But we're in the initial kind of onset of the hype cycle right now. So the idea of being able to confuse, snake oil from real value, I think that's something that the market's having a lot of difficulty doing. As that settles down, I think the proof's going to be in the pudding. If folks that are going back and thinking through risk management in the ways that we talked about before, all those different things, they're going to quickly understand the difference between actual value that they can get from this sort of tooling and the things that are more, markety or salesy just on their own merit.